The wind off the northern sea bit sharp as knives, and beneath its keening, a single torch burned at the edge of the world. Vala stood on the blackstone cliffs of Vesterhalmer, cape snapping like the sails of his ancestors' ships, eyes searching the horizon for ships that would never come home. The torch was for his mother and the lost. Vala's village, Kelda, nestled inland from the cliffs, sheltered by pine and old stone. It was a place where songs were sung louder than the storm, and every winter was one with tales spun by the hearth. But winter had swallowed more than crops this year. A fever, green and sly, crept in on the boots of a trader and left as quietly, taking with it half of Kelda, including Vala's mother, Bryndis, and his sister, Eldred. He could barely hold the names in his mouth. The clan headman, Ormar, told him to honor the dead by living well. But Vali, newly come to adulthood, did not want to honor or to live. He wanted the fury of the sea, the vengeance that seared the blood, the answers that the gods themselves hid in riddles and cold. On that night, the first solstice since the fever, when even the moon seemed to avert her gaze, Vali cast a token into the spray below, a wooden whale carved by his mother, smoothed by years of careful hands. He spoke no prayer and did not weep. Instead, he listened for an omen to split his sorrow as thunder splits the sky. At the edge of sound, a soft footfall. He turned to see Halla, a huntress with a fierce braid and eyes haunted by the same recent past. Her brother, Carrie, had vanished with the fever, and she, too, marked the edge between past and future with each breath. "You come for the silence or the storm?" she asked, voice low as moss on stone. Vala shrugged, wordless. For a while, they stood together, torch crackling. Then Halla did something unexpected. She unclipped from her belt a tiny bronze charm, a boat with a single sail, the sort given to children on their naming day, and handed it to Vali. "For the journey we're now forced to take," she said. They returned to Kelda together, steps uncertain in the darkness, silence pressed between them. At the longhouse, Ormar greeted them with grave nods, and Vali realized how hunched the headman's shoulders had become since spring. Around the hearth, old Sifa recited the legend of Onrim, who, struck by endless night and loss, had dared to walk the road of bones to plead with Orlog, the weaver of fates. She told it differently than Vali remembered. In her telling, Angrim's journey was not for revenge, but for understanding, and he returned not with his son restored, but with knowledge that made his clan strong, and his heart lighter with the burden of shared sorrow. Vali listened, fingers closing around Halla's charm, and felt the story seep into the cracks where hope used to dwell. The next morning, a stranger arrived in Kelda, an old woman shrouded in gray wool, her staff carved with looping runes never seen before. She introduced herself by no name, only an epithet, the Watcher from Fold, and claimed to serve Helra, goddess of what waits unseen. The villagers eyed her with suspicion. Vali, desperate for anything that might offer direction or distraction, approached her as she sat by the frozen well. "What will the gods do for the grieving now?" he asked, bitterness unhidden. The Watcher smiled, eyes sharp as crow feathers. "The gods do not dry tears, boy. They teach you to drink their salt and find wisdom, if you have the will to seek it. Tonight is Hlimra night, the boundary of old year and new. Walk to the standing stones on the ridge before dawn, and perhaps Helra will send an answer, if not the one you expect." The stones, Vegerver, the pillars, had marked the rise and fall of generations. Legend said that on Hlimra night, those who had lost might hear the voices of the gone as the world tilts toward the unseen. Vala did not entirely believe, but the Watcher's gaze clung to his thoughts, so he told no one and left as soon as the moon had risen. Along the frozen ridge, between giants of rock, he felt every heartbeat as a tally of what he'd lost. He placed Halla's boat charm at the base of the largest stone and whispered Brindy's name, Eldred's, even the dead sheep whose presence he missed. The wind shifted, a hush, then a pulse, as if the world itself exhaled. For moments there was nothing. Then, shapes stirring, voices thin as breath on glass. "Your grief is not a stone to be carried, but a river to be crossed. Cross it, and you may find what waits not ahead, but within." Vali knelt in the snow, spent, somewhere between longing and numbness. Dawn painted the stone blood red, then faded. He returned to Kelda changed, though he could not name it yet. The watcher, on the verge of leaving, caught his eye. "You heard them?" she asked, without a question mark. "I heard something, but it did not ease me." She nodded. "It never does. But you have begun, that is enough. Others must also cross. You are not meant to wait alone." That afternoon, Halla found him crafting a new charm, a rough little seal, nothing like his mother's wail, but true for his hands. She smiled a rare, small smile. "For your journey?" she asked. "For ours," he replied. Spring came slow and reluctant. Vali and Halla, along with Ormar's son Eskil and quiet, limping Sifa, set out to trace the river beyond the headland, hoping to trade, to forget, or perhaps to build something new. Their steps launched not from adventure, but from emptiness. And yet, step after step, story after story, the beginnings of something ancient stirred under the weight of so much loss. A hope not for restoration, but for meaning. And as the wind followed them into myth and the pillars watched from the cliffs, Helra's words echoed. The river of grief must be crossed, and only on its far bank can new life ever be found. The river that wound from Kelda was called Golrin, Gold Reach, but in spring its waters roared dark with melt and memory. Vali, Halla, Eskil, and Sifa set out along its bank, their feet finding purchase in mud newly freed from frost. Vali wore his grief like a second shadow, the story of the standing stones and the voices there clung cold behind his eyes, sharper than the wind. Each night, the four pitched camp beneath trees waking sluggish from winter. The embers of their fire flickered in a ring of rocks, smoke tangling in Halla's braid as she skinned rabbits, and Eskil set lines for grailing. Sifa listened more than she spoke, her stories driftwood shaped smooth by time rather than storm. "Why this journey?" Eskil murmured one night, fidgeting with a length of twine. "We could have stayed, rebuilt the byre, mended what's left." Halla's eyes glinted in the gloom. "Because something in us broke that can't be mended with timber." Vali heard the stones, so we follow where that leads. Maybe we circle back, but maybe we find what loss asks of us. Sifa nodded. Some wounds want a wider road than home can give. That's why the old stories never truly end inside a village. On the 10th day, they reached a ford where the waters frothed bright beneath the sky. There, staked in the shallows, was a net woven with red wool. The sign, Sifa whispered, of a river white's claim. "If you cross without offering," she cautioned, "the river drags a year's happiness from you." That's the price the old stories sing. Vali, by now accustomed to sacrificing parts of himself, stepped forward. He had the little seal he'd carved, a token meant as comfort for Halla, but now ringing of necessity. He placed it on a smooth stone at water's edge, whispering not a prayer but a confession. "I come empty-handed. If you will, spare what little hope we carry." Nothing happened for long heartbeats, save the swirl and hiss of the water. Then the net went slack. Eskil, bold, waded through first, grabbing Vala's arm halfway when the current seized his ankle. They crossed shivering, but whole. Halla lingered, eyes closed, lips moving in words Vali could not hear. On the far bank, the world changed. The land became harsher. Birch gave way to stunted pine. Stones jutted like ribs from the earth. Frost lingered in hollows no matter the sun. And at twilight, a figure watched from the shadows. A girl no older than Eldred, barefoot even in the chill, hair unbound. Her face streaked with the white dust of the dead. She spoke in a language ancient, yet somehow plain. "You carry more than hunger and fear. The whites have seen your tokens, but grief is not resolved by trade. Do you seek the Loneblood, the Lake of Names?" They hesitated, but Halla stepped forward. "Is it real?" The girl smiled. "All things are real until they aren't. The lake waits north. There, the dead may speak and the living may listen. Once, and only once, for the cost of what you hope to find." Sifa looked weary but kind. "What's your name, girl?" She shook her head. "Names are for those who stay. I am only a guide while you walk the grief road." Eskil cursed softly. It sounded more like a plea. But the girl led them through winding woods, over ridges littered with bones and feather offerings from crows, until the trees leaned inward and the air took on a blue hush. They came upon the lake at dawn, its surface thick with morning fog. Around its edge, cairns rose from moss, each crowned with shards of bone, beads, or tiny runes carved on driftwood. It smelled of peat and secrets. "Speak your sorrow, and the lake may answer," the girl said, then vanished among the rushes, leaving Valley and the others before the water. Hela went first. She knelt and whispered for Carrie, the brother gone in fever, her voice quaking but stubborn. Eskil, after a long hesitation, asked for his grandfather, who died before he'd learned to hunt. Sifa called softly for a lover whose face she'd not dared to remember until now. Valley waited until the sun topped the pines. He spoke for Brindis and Eldred and for himself, who felt loster than all of them. Then, thin as a heron's cry over ice, voices echoed across the lake. Not words, but knowing, a wash of feeling, regret, promise, forgiveness, and grief braided so tightly they could barely tell which belonged to whom. Tears trickled down their faces, each feeling both heavier and unburdened. The lake's surface calmed. A single white feather drifted onto the weeds at Vala's feet. A sign, perhaps, or only wind. Hala reached and squeezed Vala's hand. Once for courage, once for sorrow, once for a hope they could not yet speak. They left tokens at the cairns and made their camp by the lake, sharing memories as trade for peace. Every tale lightened the load, every laugh ringing truer than before. Their journey had no clear end, only the knowledge that to turn back now was impossible. By the next morning, the lake's fog receded, and on the far side a path of flat stones gleamed, tracing northward, deeper into myth and meaning. As they crossed, Valley understood at last what old Sifa's stories had always tried to tell. The road is not for finding what is lost, but for becoming someone with room enough to carry both the loss and the story that comes after. And so they pressed on, into the unknown. The flat stones led the travelers through a land made of twilight, where dawn lingered low and shadows stretched toward them like memory. Kjarval, Hala, Eskil, and Sifa pressed onward, their burdens eased but not vanished after the meeting with the Lake of Names. The white feather Valley found at his feet was tied carefully to his belt, a silent companion. Their footsteps struck stone and peat, echoing between stands of wind-stunted pine. Some nights, the northern lights shimmered above the horizon, green fire curling around the treetops. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next sorrow to fall or a miracle to bloom. On the third evening, they came upon a village surrounded by thorns, arched. The houses were low and close, roofs weighted by rock so that the wind would not carry them away, and thorny hedges grew wild around the borders. A bell tolled, slow and deep, as they approached. A crowd formed, grim, tired faces, many marked with recent loss. An old woman with a heavy gold torque met them at the gate. "You are not from here. No traveling song has warmed these stones since the old fever." Sifa stepped forward, her limp more pronounced after days of march. "We come only to share the fire and the tale. We trade story for sanctuary." The villagers conferred in hushed tones, then led the four inside. The longhouse was dim but warm, scented of juniper and earth. They shared bitter roots and dried fish, but more than that, they listened. Hala sang Carrie's name in a voice raw but sure. Sifa told of dances under vanished moons. Eskil spoke a blessing for all who wanted to forget but could not. The magic wasn't obvious, just a loosened tightness in faces, an urge to dare a smile or a laugh that sounded like it had not left a throat in years. When night grew thick, the old woman, called Frid, nodded at Valley. "What about you, stranger?" He looked into the coals, saw his mother's hands shaping whale fat into candles, his sister's eyes wide with mourning stories, the shape of his own grief, and the mark it left in the world. "I lost nearly everything, and nearly myself because of it," Vala said simply. "But on the ridge I heard that grief is not a stone, it's a river. I'm learning to cross." Frid reached over, gently touched the feather at his belt. "A sign from the lake?" she asked. "Yes. That is a rare gift," she said. "We once sent a basket to the lake, floated it out with the name of every child we buried. When dawn came, the basket was gone, and in its place, a stone shaped like a heart. Sometimes the dead answer, but sometimes it's the living who must find voices." Before dawn broke, Frid led them all to a clearing by a creek running through Arkth. There, the village gathered, and each told a single memory of a son, a friend, a stolen evening, a hope. Stones were painted and set in the earth, bright as new seeds. It was not joy that filled the space, but a kind of breath, air moving through empty rooms. The next morning, the four left arched with more supplies and more stories. The villagers waved in silence, a new tradition born, perhaps, the beginning of their own way to cross the river of sorrow. The path north now veered into deep hinterland. The birch grew thick and dark, the river forked, rising toward mountains. Midway up the slope, the travelers met a group of nomads, the Svanner, whose leader, a woman named Truda, wore a cloak of swan feathers. They welcomed the travelers beside their fire, exchanging not just food but prophecy. Truda, reading the cracks in an egg, sighed. "You are crossing grief, yes, but beware, the river deepens before the far shore." Sometimes it is the old stories themselves that must be let go before the new can take root. Sifa, who listened to spirits in the wind, grew still. "What do we lose if we let go of story?" "Not what is true," Truda answered, "but the parts that keep us chained." The night passed in shared riddles and silent comfort. In the morning, Truda handed Eskil a sprig of rowan. For luck. To Halla, she offered a red string. For binding, if you find a wound you cannot close. To Sifa, a seashell, for remembering distant things. And to Valley, she pressed a black stone flecked with silver. For vision, they parted with careful goodbyes, and the Svanner's songs floated over the cold hills as blessing and warning both. The sky above the mountains shimmered with shifting color as the four walked higher, footpaths turning to scree and broken rocks. The cruel, beautiful land demanded every scrap of resolve, yet each found themselves lighter than before, old pain replaced by a sense of forwardness, as if simply moving onward could be a kind of hope. On the highest ridge, with the sun bleeding orange through cloud, they built a cairn with stones and tokens carried since Kelda. One by one, they named the losses they could finally let go: guilt, resentment, silence, fear. In the hush after, the wind seemed to change. For a moment, Valley thought he saw his mother on a nearby crest, her form blurred with light, her face proud. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and believed for the first time since fever swept Kelda that the journey was not only about loss, but about the lives waiting to be made in its wake. They slept beneath a sky wild with northern light, the darkness easing its grip, the road ahead ready to shape itself into something new. The descent from the mountains began in silence, their spirits honed and humbled by starlit night and the marking of their cairn. Below, the land uncoiled in green valleys, rivers sparkling in the sunlight, the promise of new beginnings for those willing to leave part of their burdens behind. Kjarval was the first to notice how his stride had changed. Each step seemed less a flight from pain and more an intention to meet whatever waited with open hands. He shared a glance with Halla as they picked their way from shale to moss, a mutual recognition of grief transmuting into something that might one day resemble strength. Sifa lagged, the climb having taken much of her reserve, but she pressed on, her steps small but steady, the seashell, the token from the Svanner, warm in her palm. Eskil surged ahead, eager for what he called the taste of green, occasionally whistling, drawing odd birds from the low thickets. The first village they encountered was Egabai, a place known in Kelda's tales only as the Far Farm, a marker at the world's edge. But Egabai was bustling. Steam rose from stone pits where elders boiled dye from lichen and root. Children darted through the fields with painted faces. At the village edge, a feast was being prepared. A flaxen-haired woman called Hilda emerged, braids thick with beads, arms spread in welcome. "Travelers are a blessing," she cried, and set them at the center of a long table, where bowls of stew steamed and flatbread came hot from the stones. Conversation soon revealed Egabai suffered a loss of its own. The harvest had been ruined by flood, fears for winter ran high, and the village's old hero, a widower named Gisel, had vanished trying to save livestock, presumed drowned. Each bowl lifted, each song sung, was tinged with the ache of missing kin. Halla, recalling the solace Arct found in naming their lost, stood and asked for silence. "Let us call Gisel home, if not in body, then in story." One by one, Egabai's folk spoke, of Gisel's humor, his courage in storm, the way he could find mushrooms even under snow. Some tales were small and private. A girl showed a button Giselle had carved for her frock. A young man wept remembering a lesson Giselle never finished teaching. Kjarval watched as the village softened, wounds opening not to hurt, but to breathe. Hilda pressed her hands to her chest, tears in her bright, unashamed. She beckoned Sifa to lead a prayer, and the old storyteller obliged, guiding them in a slow chant that began in sorrow and ended in gentle hope. That evening, after feasting, Hilda invited the travelers to stay. Around the fire, Eskil grew contemplative. We help people speak the names of the lost. Maybe that is enough. Maybe my father's grief would have broken if he could have done that. Sifa gazed at the fire, her face illuminated and ageless. Speaking is how we survive our grief, but listening is how we feed the living. Halla, pensive, touched the red thread the Svanner had given her, binding it around her wrist. Stories do more than remember. They reweave what's torn, if we let them. The weeks in Egabai blurred into something like belonging. Kjarval, always restless, found himself mending tools, learning the lay of the fields. Sifa taught riddles by the riverbank, and Eskil did chores with the children, laughter rippling in his wake. Halla led berry gatherings, careful always to honor the edge of the wood. Once, she caught sight of a fox and stilled, an unspoken prayer on her breath. But wanderers cannot root forever. On the day the first frost dusted the low grass, Valley, now more himself than the shadow who left Kelda, stood at the crossroads. Hilda pressed a loaf of bread and a seed necklace into his hands. Giselle taught us to give from what hurts. Blessing on your road. They headed east, where word said there lay a stone hall, Stennis, where the living and the dead feasted together each midwinter. The journey was hard, wind off the lake stinging, but each night around the fire, the four shared new stories harvested in Egabai, the fabric of their grief worn soft with use. As they neared Stennis, the air grew thin with legend. On the last night before arrival, an owl alighted near their camp, silent except for its eyes. Sifa rose, knelt, and laid the seashell in the snow before it. For all who'll never make it home. Valley, Halla, and Eskil watched as the owl bowed and flew off, carrying nothing in its talons, but a piece that shimmered over the cold clearing. At sunrise, they saw Stennis in the distance, rising from the soft mist, its stones carved with runes that glinted in the pale light. The promise of meeting myth face to face pulled them forward, their losses no less real, but at last belonging to the living world. As the travelers approached Stennis, anticipation hung heavy, knitting together remnants of stories from Kelda, Arkth, Egabai, and every campfire in between. The stone hall loomed, massive yet inviting, its walls festooned with birch torches and banners stitched with ancestral runes. From inside spilled music, pipes and drums, voices woven in chords of grief and joy. Stepping over the threshold, Kjarval felt history pulse beneath his boots. The roof soared on oaken beams, the air shivered with mingled scents of roasting lamb, mead, and pine. A broad table stretched the length of the hall, set for living and, in a quiet alcove, for the dead. A tradition as old as mourning, where each soul lost to winter or sorrow was honored with their own plate, candle, and cherished object. A woman named Runa greeted them. She bore the hall's authority in the set of her shoulders, her dark braids bound with silver thongs. At Stennis, everyone's story feeds the light. Tonight we feast for those gone and the hunger they leave behind. Halla, sensing kinship, asked Runa how the tradition began. Runa smiled, her eyes heavy with generations. My grandmother told that after the first great sickness, no living heart would speak to the lost. Stennis nearly died of silence, until a blind boy dared ask what his father would say if he were still at table. So we began to listen, and in time, found that grief and hope could eat together. The sun set, the hall filled with villagers, wanderers, and shadows, grief wearing every face. Dishes were passed slowly, and for each lost soul, a memory was named, laughter offered, tears welcomed. In the hush after each tale, Runa struck a brass bell, and the walls seemed to absorb each story, swelling with what the living risked to speak. Eskil, bolder now, toasted his grandfather. Sifa sang for the lover she had named at the lake. Halla remembered Carrie, every word adding meaning to loss. Kjarval whispered Brindis and Eldred's names, voice sure, not trembling. At midnight, the candles guttered. Many stood to speak not their own sorrows, but the hope born from carrying them. Children offered painted stones, elders gave blessings, and the dead, if they lingered, were surely fed by memory as much as by the feasts. Runa led the four to the alcove, where a bowl was set for wanderers. She asked each to mark the bowl, an object, a word, a song, so that the room would remember them, too. Kjarval placed the white feather from the lake. Halla tied her red thread around the bowl's handle. Eskil dropped in the rowan sprig. Sifa, with a small smile, set the Egabai seed necklace alongside her shell. Runa nodded. Now, your stories belong here, where all sorrow is named and fed. After the feast, the travelers were asked to stay a week. During that time, they helped prepare for the coming of night, stocking storerooms, mending banners, singing, and trading riddles with children. Each day, Kjarval felt his grief loosening, not vanishing, but transformed by repetition and welcome. On the sixth day, Runa shared with the four a prophecy from the hall's deepest rune. Those who carry sorrow openly, persist, and gather hope. The greatest winter is broken only by the story shared without shame. Night fell deep and white. Wind rattled ruined shutters, and Stennis became the heart of something new, not just for those present, but for every wayward spirit who ever hungered for love. Before leaving, the four placed each learned story, riddle, and ritual into a woven book made by the children. Take this from Stennis, Runa instructed, and seed its telling wherever you walk. The grief road is long, but what blooms along it stays alive, even as memory. The road called them east once more. Their packs were heavier, their hearts fuller, and each step echoed with the certainty that the myth they carried was not only for Kelda or Stennis, but for all the North, the living and the dead together. The wind off the ice gap was fierce, but for the first time since Kelda's fever, each welcomed it, knowing it would carry their voices as far as the world could bear. From the warmth and wisdom of Stennis, the companions set out into a late autumn that already felt like winter's hand. Now their journey became not merely a path through landscape, but a weaving of the saga itself. Every step another thread, every word another knot, each gesture echoing with the other villages, the lake, the lost. They followed frozen streams and windswept moorlands, the road of sorrow transforming, just as, within each of them, grief neither faded nor vanished, but grew roots and branches, shelter and meaning. Word of their passing reached ahead, and in each hamlet they found a table set for strangers, sometimes elaborate, oft as simple as black bread and warm broth, sometimes just a candle left burning all night in a window. Through these tokens, the people of the North declared, "You are not alone. Your pain makes the world wider, not smaller." Near the shore of the Great Lake, Miskogr, a fishing village, welcomed them amidst celebrations for the harvest not lost. Here, by an accident of fortune and weather, the herring had run in abundance, and the people, though tired and thin, rejoiced for what was left. With gratitude and humility, Kjarval and his companions contributed to the rituals. Halla sang the names of every loss she'd heard on the road. Sifa led children in crafting lanterns from words, each lantern dedicated to a promise or a memory, set and floated upon the water, a flickering flotilla for the world's unseen sorrows. Eskil found in himself a kind of leadership, quietly showing others how to face running grief rather than shun it. The simple act of mending nets, listening to fishermen who had buried sons, became a kind of sacrament. It was in Miskogr that an old man, Jarn, told them of his dream, a white bear crossing a dark river carrying four small flames on its back. "In the dream I saw your faces, not as travelers, but as guardians. Are you the bear, or just the fire?" No one had an answer, but at dusk, when a new storm threatened, Eskil set his lantern afloat with a strange certainty. "We are called to carry what burns," he said, "even when we do not know why we are chosen." Winter bit hard after the festival, the lakes freezing white, the night deepening, the wind howling with voices of things both lost and possible. The four pressed north, past places the map showed only as legends, the hill where the gods once wept, the bog where the moon first kissed the earth. Along the rim of the world, even the stars seemed larger, closer, as if seeing the travelers for what they'd become. One night, as they sheltered in a hollow, the aurora burned green and gold above. In the fire's light, Sifa told a new riddle. What can you bury that returns in bloom and never dies, even as winter rains? Hela thought. A promise. Eskil shrugged. A psalm. Gudlaug, looking at his friends in the shifting light, answered simply, grief. They laughed, soft, not sad, not bright, but wholly true. The next day, a blizzard rose with a suddenness that seemed otherworldly. The world became a roar of white. For 2 days, they huddled together, telling each other stories of home and gods, wild love and sharper loss. On the third morning, silence. The storm had passed, and the world was changed, the landscape made smooth and new by snow. Here, in the absolute quiet, Gudlaug dreamed of his mother for the first time without pain. She was sitting by a hearth so large it seemed to contain all creation. Brindis beckoned silently, patting the bench beside her. He approached, feeling smaller, younger than he'd been in years. With a smile, she handed him the wooden whale he had cast from the cliffs that first night of loss. Carry this, she whispered, not as a burden, but as a beginning. He woke before the others, the dream imprinting a tenderness he knew he would never lose again. Not long after, paths began winding south, the world blooming beneath the first hesitant sun. Villages and crossroads thrummed with word of the four who carried sorrow and left hope behind. In every town, 2 tables stood, one for the living, one for the lost, but always with a space for those crossing between. When, at last, their footsteps circled homeward, the wind behind them, Valley, Hela, Eskil, and Sifa came to the ridge overlooking Kelda, the place where every grief had begun. The saga was no longer only theirs. The villages, the lake, the great hall, the lanterns in the dark, the laughter and the songs, each woven through every broken part of them, creating not healing as forgetting, but healing as living on. Ahead, Kelda's windows glowed through snow, a welcome and a promise. Next would come the return, the last naming, and the laying down of burdens, if only for a season, at the home they never truly left. Kelda awaited them in a hush thicker than snow, its people gathered in doorways and at the foot of frost-crusted fences. Word had arrived on the wings of rumor and lantern light. The four had returned, the road of sorrow complete. Children who barely remembered Valley, Hela, Eskil, and Sifa clung to their mother's skirts. Elders stood straight in their age, eyes bright, with something between pride and awe. Gudlaug paused at the edge of the village, his friends beside him, and felt the familiar ache sharpen. This was the true test, not the crossing of ice-choked rivers or the speaking of names at the lake, but the weaving of everything learned, everything lost, into the place that had birthed both. They passed beneath the standing stones, where once Valley had heard the voices of grief. This time, he heard nothing but the wind, which somehow sounded like the distant echo of laughter, the remembered cadence of stories half told. The clan headman, Ormar, came forward, now thinner, but with a spring in his step as if time itself had grown less heavy. He greeted them not with questions or burdens, but with open arms. Come, you are home. Tell us what you have seen. That night, the village packed the longhouse, the fire burning bright and steady. A place was set for every loss. A table along the wall set with tokens, Brindy's wail, a string of beads, the painted feather, a stone from every settlement past. It began with stories, hesitant at first, then spilling forth. Sifa told riddles of towns where hope came only after sorrow was named. Eskil recounted the night lanterns floated on Muskoger, carrying grief to the far shore and returning as dreams of spring. Hela sang of the stone hall Stennis, where the dead ate with the living by right, not fancy. Gudlaug, though, spoke last. The hall hushed as he stood, the candlelight gentle on his features. I began this road wanting answers, revenge, reparation, anything to fill the hole left inside me. What I found was that grief is the river that makes us real. It roots us, changes us, gives us eyes for one another's pain and hope for one another's strength. We return not healed, but capable of healing, not restored, but made braver by emptiness and by having carried each other. No one cried, for there was nothing left unshed. In Kelda, a new tradition began. Every season, the grieving, the lost, and the unspoken would gather at the pillars. The stories would be told and retold, tokens left for old gods and new memory alike. Grief would not be banished but cherished, because only by bearing witness could the village survive whatever storms would come. As winter melted at last and the first green broke free from soil, Vali, Halla, Eskil, and Sifa walked the bounds of the village. They planted seeds from Egabai and the Svanner's Rowan Sprig, wove a new circle of names, and helped build a table that never emptied, where any wanderer could sit, regardless of what sorrow or hope they carried. Life, as it always must, continued. Children grew, dreams were broken and remade. Lanterns were floated each year on the river and at the lake. Each of the four stayed in Kelda or found other roads, sometimes alone, sometimes together, but always with the story, the journey, rooted deep in the soul. In the end, Kelda's saga was not just Vala's or Halla's or those lost to fever. It became a chain of voices, each sorrow an honored link, each hope a ring of promise, shining even as night fell. And every year, when the winds returned and the dark pressed against the stones, the people remembered what the gods and old losses had taught them. That grief, well named and well carried, became not just the mark of the lost, but the seed of all that the living could ever build together. So the saga ends, as all true stories do, not in stillness, but in echo, an echo that calls us to remembrance, to kindness, and to the road that always leads home.